All right, so here we are in round one, game one, and our opponent plays out Niv Magus Elemental and decides to get some extra damage in on us, except for one problem. He's missing land drops. He doesn't play a land after this, and he doesn't play one next turn either. So even though he is getting extra damage in, he's actually hurting himself more.
And actually, I believe this is game two. But yeah, getting the +2/+2 counters, 2+1/+1 counters on your Niv Magus Elemental at the expense of cantripping when you're missing land drops is probably not the best play, and contributes to us winning because we're also missing land drops, and we benefit from our opponent being stuck. Here, we don't discuss it because we realize later, but we fail to realize on this turn, we could actually get our Cryptborn Horror into play as a 4/4 by attacking with the Sewer Shambler and activating the Lobber Crew, and then activating the Lobber Crew again in response to the Cryptborn Horror. Instead, we just play out a Chainwalker, which is less effective than getting a 4/4 Trampler into play. Overall, we only ever play the Cryptborn Horror as a 4/4 in any of our matches, but in a lot of cases, getting a 4/4 Trampler for 3 is still good enough.
We were expecting to get through with possibly the Chainwalker or the Shred Freak by putting more threats down, but assuming that our opponent would not play more creatures is probably bad play on our part.
In particular, we were only thinking at that point that our Cryptborn Horror would be a 3/3 and couldn't get through the 3/4 Niv Magus Elemental, and us failing to realize that we could actually make him a 4/4 right away slowed us down a little bit. We still win the game, but it was probably the correct play to get the Cryptborn Horror down as a 4/4.
All right, so here we are in the next to final, or the final attack step of this game, and we discuss whether or not the opponent has downsized, because we've already passed the point where a Bluster Squall would stop us. And we talk about, I push for pushing the Chainwalker because if he has the downsize, he has to play it or he loses. Whereas if we don't attack with the Chainwalker, he gets to decide to chump the Cryptborn Horror and potentially draw up to 2 more cards, hoping to get to the downsize, in which case we don't want him to have 2 more turns.
And in particular, we don't discuss during the game situation here that even if he has the downsize and he eats our Gorehouse Chainwalker, we actually still have, thanks to our Lobber Crew, we have such a tight clock on him and enough things that we can draw into that letting him eat our Chainwalker in exchange for the downsize is still okay. His Desecration Demon, as scary as it might seem, we can keep pumping out guys that we can sack to keep it tapped down, that we will be able to still grind him out before he can probably kill us.
Also of note, we end the game with 3 land.
Oh, that's right. We wanted to discuss that some decks and some deck archetypes are built in such a way that you can win with only having a few lands in play. And we've discussed a few times through our draft videos that 2-color decks statistically win more than 3-color decks because of the mana consistency. And we want to point out that this opponent here was actually playing Grixis. He showed red, not just a blue-red card like the Elemental, but actual red cards and red lands, mountains, or guild gates in the first game. And here in round 2, he never gets his red mana. He has 4 cards in hand, and it's extremely likely that he is stuck with 2 or 3 red cards in his hand the whole time, and probably kept his hand on the strength of the Desecration Demon or some expectation that he'd be able to get Desecration Demon and finish this out. And he's land screwed for a long time and then probably color screwed. And our 2-color deck, despite the fact that we only ever get to 3 lands, and our opponent gets all the way up to 5, which is not a lot, but more than us, and we're still able to win the game fairly handily, and we're generally in pretty good control of the game, is an important lesson.
Also means his mistake of eating the inaction injunction is compounded this whole game.
All right, so we will see you guys here in a minute for round 2. All right, we are here in round 2, and the first thing that we wanted to point out in round 2 was this time where we were going to Slum Reaper and make him sacrifice his guy, and then we were going to sacrifice our own Slitherhead and scavenge the Slitherhead onto one of our attackers, but somehow we think the client messed up and we lost our priority when, after sacrificing a creature, we already wound up in the begin combat phase and we were unable to scavenge. And we were confused during the making of the original video, and upon watching it again, we don't see where we screwed up. So we think it was actually probably the client that just jumped past, and we missed out on a few points of damage, but in the end it didn't wind up costing us.
All right, here we are in round 2, and it's just worth noting on this particular play that the absence of the mountain changes this entire line of play. With the mountain already on the board, there's no argument about whether or not we attack with the Slum Reaper. You just do it, because getting the extra damage in with the Lobber Crew guaranteed in hand is vastly different than just hoping he goes for it.
Yeah, being able to follow this attack up with any further play changes the value of getting him all the way down to 7 life, despite potentially losing a Slum Reaper in a poor exchange. Given that we were kind of stuck on mountains, it seemed better to keep our better creature back and force him to trade for a worse creature. But it turns out he has a giant growth and changes the complexion a little bit, but that doesn't change what the right line of play would have been.
Okay, so here we end up later in the round. He's got the Centaur down, and we just Assassin Strike it right away. Now, we still think it's the right call, but we should have at least mentioned trying to wait for him to put the Drudge Beetle counters on something before Assassin Striking. We just completely blank on the fact that he still has Scavenge in the graveyard.
Yeah, we should have been paying a little more attention there, and in a lot of cases that'll burn you, as he now goes and scavenges right after we burn our kill spell. We win the game anyways, and we were far enough ahead and we're racing well enough that preventing the extra damage by getting a guy off the board is probably still worth it. And despite here when he scavenges onto the Stonefair Crocodile, we still have our scavenge that will enable one of our Lobber Crews to be able to block it. That the game never actually gets that far because we wind up drawing into a Carnival Hellsteed and a few other things transpire. But we just blanked, and you got to pay a little bit more attention to what's in your opponent's graveyards.
And here we want to talk to the beginners, who experienced players are always pounding it into your head: attack, then play spells, attack, then play spells, attack, then play spells. The reason we play the Racketeer first is because getting another card is more information, and having more information could possibly change our line of play. So here, it is actually correct to play the Viashino Racketeer before combat, even though it itself isn't going to change how the combat ends.
In particular, we are planning to play the Deviant Glee onto the Thrill Kill Assassin, but we may wind up drawing into a different card that makes us want to put the Deviant Glee on that creature instead. And so it could possibly affect what we actually wind up doing this turn before we attack. And here we are a few seconds later, and we've discarded the Slitherhead when we played the Racketeer, and we're discussing a little bit about what we want to do with the Slitherhead and whether we should scavenge it onto the Thrill Kill Assassin. I'm against it because I don't want to put all of our eggs in one basket, so that our Thrill Kill Assassin, Deviant Glee, and the Slitherhead counter all are lost to one removal spell. And as it stands, our Thrill Kill Assassin is already big enough to overcome the creature our opponent has on the board, so it doesn't really gain us a lot. Then I talk about scavenging onto the Racketeer, but it sounds like in the original discussion that I'm still talking about the Thrill Kill Assassin when I comment that after scavenging the Slitherhead, it would still have 2 toughness. That was in reference to the Racketeer. And scavenging onto the Racketeer and having it still only have 2 toughness so that it would still trade with either of our opponent's creatures doesn't accomplish much. If we had a creature that we could get up to 3 toughness so that it could block the Drudge Beetle, then scavenging the Slitherhead might have actually accomplished something. But instead we realize our best line of play is going to be to play the Rakdos Rage Mutt when we get the chance and scavenge onto that for the extra life from lifelink.
Which gives us the time to win the game. Here we are in the final attack of round 2, where we're going to win. Our opponent doesn't understand. It's possible that there was an RTFC error. that he didn't understand that Deviant Glee grants trample and the interaction between trample and death touch. Death touch says that any 1 point of damage is lethal, and trample says once you've assigned lethal damage, extra damage goes over.
Or you are allowed to assign extra damage. You are also allowed to overkill a creature if for some reason you want to, and the MTGO interface will actually pop up little controllers that let you assign how much damage, but the default will be to assign only lethal and have the rest trample over. As it turns out, our opponent just blocks with a bird token, and the interaction with Death Touch doesn't actually wind up mattering. In the original video, we have a fair amount of discussion about whether we will play Street Spasm, because also due to the requirement for assigning lethal damage, when you have a trampler and you do damage to a creature before you assign combat damage, you will be able to assign your extra combat damage to the player because it took fewer points of damage to be lethal. For example, with a 3/3 Centaur, even if you only Street Spasm for 2, then the creature with trample that's attacking doesn't have to do as much damage to kill it and can trample more over. And when you have a card like Street Spasm that can't do damage to a player, and sometimes you can get trample damage, you can get damage to the player in conjunction with a trampler. In this case, since our guy had Death Touch, it was kind of irrelevant because it only needed 1 point of damage to be lethal in the first place.
Yeah, the only difference would be if we hadn't had the Death Touch, then Street Spasming to get the extra damage through, as you said, would have been completely viable.
Overall, a lot of people just forget Trample plus Death Touch is a very powerful combination. All right, guys, we will be back in a moment here with round 3, wherein Robert and I conspire to screw everything up. All right, so here we are in the second game, and on this turn, we're going to make our first mistake. Our opponent has just used Void Wielder to bounce the Hellhole Flailer back to our hand, and the Lobber Crew is no longer summoning sick, and we think that we're just going to replay the Lobber Crew and replay the Hellhole Flailer and get an extra point of damage in with the Lobber Crew. But after we actually go ahead and tap the Lobber Crew to do the point of damage based on this assumption that that's our line of play, but we keep talking. And instead of getting everything worked out properly ahead of time, after tapping the Lobber Crew, we realize we're going to miss a land drop and that we probably need to play the Viashino Racketeer instead of the Hellhole Flailer in order to try and dig for lands. And that, as a result, means that our Lobber Crew does not untap as we were expecting it to when we played the Hellhole Flailer. And as a result, we wind up taking a point of damage when he attacks with his Void Wielder on the next turn. And also, we just look kind of silly for tapping the Lobber Crew and then not untapping it. Our opponent probably figured out for himself that we were intending to replay the Hellhole Flailer and changed our mind because after having bounced it, he knew that we had it. And also, we discussed earlier during the draft section about having Axebane Guardians and being able to accelerate into big fatties being potentially problematic. But it turns out, actually, it's not the Risen Sanctuary that causes us problems. It's this 1 damage right here that changes the game. If it weren't for that 1 damage right there, we would have won the game. And we have some more opportunities where we give away some more damage.
So here, he goes to play second Void Wielder, and I make the mistake of thinking that because my card became highlighted when I highlight his effect, I make the mistake of thinking that because my card is highlighted when I highlight his effect, that is the one he has targeted. This is a change from the old client. The old client, when you mouse over their card, the giant arrow points from the effect to whatever it's targeting, and I confused them and figured that was what he was targeting, when in reality, what was showing up was all of the cards that had active effects on them that I could respond to the Void Wielder effect with.
For example, see the lands at the bottom that are untapped, which have an ability that he can use to tap for mana.
So, yeah, I miscued on that, and so we tap this Lobber Crew, and he bounces the other one. So yet again, we're taking an extra point of damage from a Void Wielder that he attacks with.
Yeah, what we needed to have done was to actually have moused over the ability so that then the new client, the beta client, shows these little gold arrows or something like that that shows what the ability is actually targeting. And once again, just the 1 extra damage does in fact wind up mattering. We've given the 1 extra damage away twice on just miscues and miscommunications and just complete blunders on our part. And on this turn, the next turn, we just go ahead and slam down the Assassin Strike on the Risen Sanctuary, and we don't even really discuss the possibility of just playing out a second Lobber Crew and playing a Sewer Shambler to chump block the Risen Sanctuary for another turn, because one thing, it was probably reasonable to kill the Risen Sanctuary because we wanted to make him discard a card, but he turns out he has a forest that he's able to throw away and we hit nothing relevant. But for us to attempt to try and race him, putting down a second Lobber Crew and getting the Sewer Shambler into our graveyard to be able to scavenge onto our Hellhole Flailer would have been of some assistance.
Yeah, even though next turn he plays the Asperia Skywatch, and we still would have Assassin Striked the Risen Sanctuary, but now we would have Assassin Striked the Risen Sanctuary and had a second Lobber Crew in play already, so that when we play the Carnival Hellsteed, we can get a damage off of it right away.
So here we are a few turns later, and despite all of our scripts earlier giving up a couple of damage, this one here is where we really decide the game. Robert and I argue back and forth over whether or not to play the Carnival Hellsteed or whether or not to play the Lobber Crew and the Sewer Shambler. And as it turns out, we play the Carnival Hellsteed, which just gets chump blocked all day long, which is kind of what I was expecting. And because our Lobber Crew is detained when we play it, we don't even get an extra damage from playing a multicolor spell here. By comparison, if we played out the Lobber Crew and the Sewer Shambler and get the extra damage when we play the Hellhole Flailer and the Carnival Hellsteed on subsequent turns, then we would actually still be able to win the game. Additionally, having the extra Lobber Crew in play would allow us to block both of the Void Wielders that he attacks with on his next turn. And because of the damage that we gave up earlier in the game, he has us on exact damage. If we'd had one more life, we would have had another turn. So we could have won playing the Carnival Hellsteed.
Only if we had not taken the extra damage earlier in the game.
But even in that scenario, we're still kind of winning despite the Hellsteed, not so much because the Hellsteed is actually getting damage in. He's able to chump block with a bunch of walls that aren't really doing a lot to advance his game plan or his damage, and the Hellsteed just doesn't really accomplish much. But with the second Lobber Crew in play, we would be able to shoot him down to just enough life that then the Hellhole Flailer with a Sewer Shambler that's already in our graveyard scavenged onto him would be able to kill him even without the extra turn.
Or also, actually, this is what I forgot. Keeping the Hellsteed back as a blocker instead of unleashing him and attacking would stop the extra damage from the Void Wielders and would give us the time to Lobber Crew him out.
Yeah, so we just miscalculated on pretty much every level. And even worse than that, here in a moment, you're going to see we make just the worst kind of, like, we are feeling helpless or like we screwed up already and the game's over and we just quit kind of caring. And we actually do have a number of outs in our deck where we still could have won, but we just punt completely here. So here we are just a little bit later, and we make one of the worst mistakes we made in any of our videos, and a kind of mistake that Robert and I very rarely make. This is an example of what we would call tilt, where things start going a little bit wrong and things are not going your way, and you just get frustrated, and you kind of, in your heart of hearts or whatever, give up a little bit on the game. You think you can't win, you quit believing that you can win, you quit thinking about your outs, or something happens, you lose, your attention wanders a little bit. Here, we just completely forget to activate our Lobber Crew on our opponent's end phase and just give up on a damage. And as a result of that, on our turn, we draw into a swamp, which doesn't help us at all. But with all of the things that we could do, we can get our opponent down to 2 life. If we had drawn any multicolor spell or a stab wound, we still would have been able to win despite all of our mistakes, so long as we remember to do that 1 damage. And the fact that we get to this point and we forget even the outs that we could draw into still wouldn't win us a game. And so repeatedly, 1 little damage here and 1 little damage there prevents us from having the extra turn we need, and prevents us from having the ability to draw into an out that would win the game despite all of our mistakes.
All right, thanks for watching that, and I hope you had fun listening to us rip ourselves apart.
See you next time.